France in the Middle Ages. It was a place where politics relied on domestic tradition, a patriarchal form of life. There were the masters on one side and their subordinates on the other. Private life also reflected this structure. The ugliest disputes in early medieval France between the heads of the families and the church were fought for the control of marriage. The church claimed the victory. In general, medieval France was made up of a complex conglomerate responsible for the physical and spiritual well-being of their subjects. The knights were at the forefront of the fight against heresy, astrology, superstition, and witchcraft. These practices tarnished the honor of the village. Kings and bishops headed the two main political powers, the temporal and the spiritual. They believed they were the trustees of God and thought he inspired and protected them. Public power acquired a sacred nature, and an office was viewed as a sacramentum, an oath. To break the promise was to incur the wrath of God. Medieval France was often a battlefield, a ground of war. But in its darkest places, it was quiet. Vast areas of wilderness protected those who wished to live outside the orthodox society. Forests, desolate and mysterious, were the perfect scenarios for the legendary knight. For these men, it was God's land, one whose stillness would roar eternally in the pages of history. At least for one man, the Cluniac monk Ralph Glaber, whose writings shed light on the Middle Ages of France, the crucifixion held one extraordinary secret: the explanation of why this land was the chosen territory in the divine master plan. According to Glaber, writing about 1040, the position of the Holy Cross as viewed from Jerusalem and Calvary, facing west, with Jesus' right hand pointing north, was the clearest sign of where the future would lie: the Northwest, Francia. Glaber was sure there was no coincidence. The conversion of the Hungarians and the Normans was proof, he was certain, of the extension of Christianity to the Northwest. Eventually, France became not only a sanctuary to perpetuate the legacy of Christ, but the land that provided a model for man's political, artistic, and economic future. The core of medieval France lies in Roman history. The westward direction described by Glaber's theory on the crucifixion also explained the succeeding transfer of power from the Greeks to the Romans to the Franks. The Roman Empire remained intact well into the 5th century, until its western half was won by the Franks, the Visigoths, and the Burgundians, and gradually occupied by others. The fall of the Roman Empire created such a strong alliance between the kings of the Franks and the papacy that it sealed the fate of Western Christendom. Constantine the Great, for whom Constantinople was named, gave the Lateran Palace to the bishops of Rome and built the first church there, using the classical model known as basilica. In the early 4th century, Constantine started calling the head of the church Pope, which signified the supremacy conferred to St. Peter by Jesus Christ. Christianity became the official religion of Rome and spread throughout northwestern Europe. Paganism's days were numbered. However, its practices were still rooted in French soil. For example, the Cathedral of Lectoure in southern France was built on the site of the great pagan temple dedicated to Cybele, where worshippers had been initiated by being drenched in the blood of a slaughtered bull. The movement towards conversion began at the upper echelons of power. French power up until 1460 is divided into 5 important periods: the dynasty of the Merovingians, which followed the reign of two Frankish chiefs, Pharamond and Clodion, the Carolingians, the Capetians, and the Valois. The work of three kings that belonged to the Merovingian and Carolingian dynasties had a major effect on religion. In the year 508, Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Christianity in Rheims. In 754, Pope Stephen II asked Pepin, ruler of the Franks, to fight religious enemies in Italy. Pepin agreed and defeated them. His son, Charlemagne, overthrew the king of the Lombards and became their king as well. Power, it seems, gave Frankish people a sense that the divine accompanied their leaders, a virtue that would characterize the crown for centuries to come. Over time, the influence of the papacy and its Christian ideals, as well as Rome's cultural imprint on France, reinvented themselves, culminating in expressions that today still stimulate human imagination. Aix-en-Provence is a living example of France's Roman past. In about the year 122 before Christ, the Roman consul Sextius founded Aix-en-Provence, which derives its name from the Latin Aquae Sextiae, or the waters of Sextius. The thermal springs originally drew the Romans to the area. Almost 1,000 years later, the monk Glaber, writing about Rome's cultural impact on France, stated the Franks were the chosen people of God, for they inherited the Holy Roman Empire restored by Charlemagne. In the first 1,000 years A.D., Europe lived through a period of transition. During this time, humanity abandoned its nomadic lifestyle, and the whole European region adapted to a new way of life. The coronation of Charlemagne had an enormous impact on Gaul. With him, the empire leaped into an accelerated evolution. The smallest changes he made transformed history forever. Charlemagne was the first Grand Seigneur of the Table. During his reign, the use of human skulls or horns of wild bulls as drinking goblets was abandoned. The emperor was also the first of the lords to allow women to sit at the table. Charlemagne's reign lasted 46 years, ending in 814, but his legacy lasted centuries. As the new millennium approached, radical changes were observed. Society evolved, described the monk Glaber, as a result of sudden changes. He wrote, "In the year 1000, after the Passion of our Lord, the heavy rains and storms abated, obedient to God's loving mercy. The earth was covered with luxuriant vegetation and abundance of fruits." With these favorable conditions, peasants who depended on the soil for their sustenance began to find themselves with crop surpluses. As a result, the population increased, which in turn meant larger income for the lords. Simultaneously, the revenues enabled warriors to acquire improved weapons. People started to travel, and an enormous increase in circulation of precious metals was recorded. Revenues from the sale of precious metals found buried were used to rebuild cathedrals. It was believed this practice would lead God to look mercifully upon the land, sending rain when it was needed. The final farewell to the darker ages took time, and the settlement of groups of families